points made from the cross, and then how they apply to us. Please understand something. This is about us growing in Him. That's what church is for, and we will end up, hopefully, around Easter with the last saying. But I'm going to paint a picture tonight that may be a little uncomfortable. But the reason it's uncomfortable is because we're going to look at the real facts of the crucifixion. And then we're going to talk about Jesus' statements from the cross. And we're going to talk about one in particular. It's the very first thing He says once He's on the cross. And so once we get there, I want you to think about it in these terms. Have you ever had somebody do something to you that you just, man, I just can't get over that. That person just hurt me so badly. And I just don't know what to do. And I just can't get over it. You know, I've seen stories like that. I've heard people like that. You know, I think of the family in Texas whose daughter was killed by a drunk driver. And the drunk driver was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was 19 years old when he did it. He was drinking and driving. He shouldn't have been, and he knew it. And he was in prison. He was sent to prison for 19 years. 20 years for vehicular homicide. And the rules have changed in Texas. They're a lot stricter now than they were. But at this time, it was considered, you know, it wasn't premeditated murder. In Texas now, if you drink and drive, they'll charge you with premeditated murder, and you can get the death penalty for it. But in this case, he got 20 years. He was 19 years old. He'd never been in trouble with the law, never had a problem. But he made the mistake, made the bad judgment to drink and drive. And a young lady who was just in her senior year in high school, she was on her way home. She had been, you know, her family were Christians, and that she had been at a fundraiser for a local orphanage. It was raising funds for kids so they could have something for Christmas. And so she had worked really hard and had done a lot of work, and she had been there, you know, working the booth and stuff, trying to raise money for these kids. So she was giving her own time, and she was on her way home. And she got to the intersection, and the guy missed the turn. He was drunk and ran right through the red light and broadsided her. She died on the way to the hospital. He was tried and convicted and sent to prison. And the mom's like, and if you read what she says, she basically says, I really struggled with this. I really wanted vengeance. I really wanted to see him put away for the rest of his life and never come out, because my daughter didn't deserve all this. And she said, I was reading through the book of Luke, and I came to that part, the same verse we're going to talk about tonight, Luke 23:34, which says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I thought, can I hold a grudge when God didn't hold a grudge against us? And the reality is that she realized that it was not something that she could do, that she had to figure out how to forgive him. But how do you forgive in a situation like that? I mean, how do you forgive when by definition what has happened to you, you consider to be unforgivable? I mean, this person did this to you. This person, and we do it all the time when we were betrayed, or we were hurt, or we were brutalized, and we think, oh man, nobody, you could possibly understand this, Pastor Mike. You know, the reality is that you just don't understand what I've been through. You don't understand the torture, the hardship, or the pain I've been through. There's just no way you get it. How could God possibly ask me to forgive them? So, take yourself back in time a little bit. It's Friday morning, 9 a.m. And outside the Damascus Gate is a road. On the other side of the road is a flat area near the spot where the prophet Jeremiah is buried. Up above is a rocky outcropping that, if studied at a certain angle, kind of looks like a skull. You can see eroded in the limestone 2 sockets for the eyes, a place for the nose, and maybe a place for the mouth. They call it Skull Hill or Golgotha. It was the place that the Romans did their killing. And Friday was the day, and 9 o'clock was the time. Soldiers were ready to do their dirty work. They were Roman soldiers. They were from another part of the world. They weren't from Palestine. They weren't from Israel. They weren't followers of the law. They were simply soldiers who had a job to do. And it happened to be that they were on the death squad. And they were in charge of crucifixions. On this particular Friday morning, the workload was a little bit light. Only 3 this week. And they didn't know the names. They never did. And it really didn't matter. They were just the executioners. From their point of view, it didn't pay to stop and think about what they did. It was for someone up the ladder. Guilt or innocence wasn't their concern. They'd go crazy if they started worrying about things like that. They just had a job to do. And to do their job, they needed 2 things. They needed toughness, and they needed good technique. If they did a sloppy job, they were certain to hear about it later. And so it's 9 o'clock, and up the road comes guards leading a guy, and 3 guys carrying their crossbeams. The soldiers know that 2 of the men being crucified are just average, ordinary criminals, the kind of low-life scum that fills any big city anywhere. It's no big deal. They're rebels. They've probably killed a Roman guard, and this is their punishment. The 3rd man, the one from up north, the preacher from Nazareth, well, his case is a little different. They don't really know who he is. They know it's important because they sense the buzz in the crowd. There are more people than usual. By the way, that was one of the fringe benefits, if you want to call it that, for being on the crucifixion squad. You never worked alone. There's something morbidly fascinating about watching someone else die. The people of Jerusalem, at least some of them, loved to come out and see the crucifixions. Well, maybe they didn't love it, but they couldn't stay away. Some strange magnetic force that drew them back to Skull Hill again and again. But this day there were more people than usual. A huge crowd, actually, noisier, rowdier, milling to and fro and waiting for the action to begin. Up the road comes a parade, led by a brawny foreigner carrying a cross. That shouldn't be the one that was going to crucify. It turns out he was just a man by the name of Simon. Simon of Cyrene. The crowd swirls around him, and behind him is a stooped figure, a man not quite 6 feet tall, now walking, now crawling, each step in agony to behold. More a creature than a man at this point, from the worst nightmare you'd ever imagined. He'd been beaten within an inch of his life. His back was in shreds. His front was covered with the markings of the whip. His face was disfigured and swollen where they had ripped out the beard by its roots. On his head, a crown of thorns, 6 inches long, stuck under the skin. A shell of a man already more dead than alive. When the followers on the crucifixion taught that, they weren't unhappy, because sometimes people got a little feisty when you tried to nail them to a cross. No, they didn't mind getting a person who was almost dead already, because it meant that their work would be a lot easier. They laid the cross out on the ground, and they laid the body of Jesus on the cross. He moved, he moaned, he didn't do much. One hand over there, one hand over here, wrapping rope around his arm and around his arm, rope around the legs, probably bent and partially resting on a small platform. They drove the spike of the forearm side into the wrist so that when the weight of the cross fell, the spike wouldn't rip all the way through the hand. Spike in both wrists and a spike through the feet. The ropes in place, they began to pull the cross up. Jesus now spurts blood from the raw wounds. Steady now, boys, steady. Don't drop it. It was a terrible thing to drop a cross before they got it to the top. They dropped it in and fell with a thud. And there was Jesus, naked and exposed before the world. Beaten, bruised, bloody. The soldiers stood back satisfied. Another good job, another day done. Someone yelled out, "Oh, get the dice. Let's roll for what's left of his clothes." What they did that day, folks, was unforgivable. That's the definition of what unforgivable is. When you crucify the Son of God, you have done with that which is beyond forgiveness. It is truly unforgivable. And yet Jesus said in his first word from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." That was the unforgivable sin, yet Jesus said, Father, forgive them. A question which is great relevance for us today, a question which is not too theological or historical, but a question which a lot of us are wrestling with right now. How do you forgive the unforgivable? How do you forgive someone who has done something to you so terrible that it defies any attempt at human forgiveness? Next to him, 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with Jesus to be crucified. And when they came to the place called the Skull, they were crucified with him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And Jesus said in Luke 23:34, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressions, according to Isaiah 53:12. Father, forgive them. Thing is, he isn't just talking about the two guys hanging next to him. He isn't talking even about just the Roman soldiers. He isn't talking about the mob, although that's part of it. He isn't talking about just Pilate. He isn't even talking just about Nero. You see, from that cross, he looked down and said, Father, forgive Michael Boyd, for he knows not what he's done. The reason I'm hanging on this cross is because Michael Boyd sinned. And the only hope he has is if I die for him in his place. Oh, I'm not alone. Believe me, I'm not alone. The reality is that Jesus died for you, and he died for me. For the bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. You see, we get that, and we can sort of understand that. I mean, okay, Christ is God, right? And he forgives, and he forgave us no matter what we did. But man, you just don't know my wife. You don't know my boss. You don't know how bad they make my life. You see, before Christ, the reality is that our reaction is, you owe me, and justice is mine. Matthew 5:18 said, for you have heard this said, that eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. That response is what the world does. We're going to get even. We're going to get revenge. We're going to get back. We're going to hurt you because you've hurt us. But the reality is, it's not God's way. See, there's a difference that goes on here, and I want you to see the difference. This is before the cross. This is before Jesus. This is before Christ's response. This is what you take. This is what you get hurt. You know, Jesus had spent his whole ministry talking about some of this stuff. Way back in Matthew, he pointed out that God forgave you. Forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Matthew 6:12. And of course, way back in Matthew 18, we get, therefore the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to come to bring his accounts up to date, and servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought to him who owed him, well, in our economy, probably billions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered it that he be sold, along with his wife, his children, and everything he's owned, to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, please be patient with me, and I will pay it all. And his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and forgave his debt. See, guys, Jesus tells this story as part of his ministry. We have some lessons we can learn here. You know, the reality is that from the servant, the debt can't always be repaid. In fact, there's a song, he owed a debt. He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. The reality is, our debt is much more than Jesus could ever pay. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in and owed him millions of dollars, and he couldn't pay. You know, the reality is that we live in a world that is offended by everything, but the offended can always show mercy. Matthew 18:27, then the master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and forgave his debt. See, the problem was he experienced God's forgiveness, but he decided that he couldn't forgive. You know the rest of the story. Another man came to the servant and said, I owe you hundreds of dollars. Give me time and I will pay it. And he told him he'd have jailed, and the master found out. So the master had him brought back before him, and he said this, You evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? The angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. That's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. You see, the reality is that we live in a place where we think that God owes us something. I'm right, you're wrong. I got a little news for you. The truth is that holding on to a grudge is pride. What? Whoa. You know, as I study Luke 23:34, a couple things come to mind that will help us understand how to forgive the unforgivable. First off, it is possible to forgive the unforgivable by remembering that the people who are hurting you do not really know what they are doing. And I'm not saying they don't know that they're hurting you. I'm saying they don't have a concept. If ever a statement seems to be obviously wrong, that's it. Someone says, well, Mike, you don't understand. That they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what they were doing before they were doing it. They knew they were going to hurt me, and they went ahead and did it anyway. When she told that lie, she knew what she was doing. When it double-crossed me, he knew what he was doing. When he stepped out on me, he knew what he was doing. When he broke the marriage vows, she knew what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. How can you even bring up that subject? They knew they would hurt me. They did it on purpose. Michael, how can you possibly say that? Consider Jesus. Who was he talking about when he said, for they know not what they're doing? Who's they were talking about? You'll say, well, the Roman soldiers. Well, did the Roman soldiers know what they were doing? Well, yes, they knew they were crucifying a man. Did they know who he was? No, they didn't really know who he was. If anybody really didn't know what they were doing, it was the Roman soldiers. It was a job to them. It was the next grisly item on the Friday agenda list. To them, crucifixion was just their commander ordered them to do. Next, please. Next, please. Hand me the nails. Crucify that guy and get him out of here. It's just a job for them. Surely they didn't really know what they were doing. Who else is the they? Well, you say it's Pilate's fault. Did Pilate know what he was doing? Well, what did Pilate say? Pilate knew that Jesus was called the King of the Jews. That's what Pilate knew. And that he knew, and what he knew scared him to death, and he tried to wash his hands of it. He knew enough to scare him, but he didn't know the whole story. What about Caiaphas? Caiaphas knew that Jesus had called the Son of God the Messiah. What did Caiaphas do? He said, I don't want nothing to do with this. Crucify him and get him out of here. Ananias, the high priest, same way. Well, you say, what about Judas? Did Jesus know what he was? Judas know? Well, he was with Jesus for 3.5 years. No, if anything is clear from the New Testament, Judas was totally confused about who Jesus was. He knew that Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah, but when you really got down to it, Judas thought Jesus was going to roll in Jerusalem, take over the place, set himself up as king. Judas was baffled because Jesus didn't fit his preconceptions about what the Messiah was. That's one of the reasons he betrayed him, because he was confused and disillusioned and disappointed. You say, Pastor, are you telling me these men are not guilty? No, I'm not saying that. Judas was definitely guilty. Pilate was guilty. Caiaphas was guilty. Ananias was guilty. The Roman soldiers were guilty. So were the Jewish leaders. The Pharisees and the scribes who conspired to put him to death. What about the mob? Well, yeah, they were guilty. What about the spectators who came to cheer and to laugh and to mock? Well, yeah, they were guilty. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garment. The thing is, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Think about that word what for a second. Key is not the fact that they did not know. The key is what. They did not know what they were doing. They know what they're doing. They do not know what it really means. They know what they're doing, but they don't know who they're really doing it to. They know what they're doing, but they don't know what the ramifications are. That is to say, they are guilty of killing a man, but they are guilty of much worse than that. They are guilty of killing the Son of God from heaven. See, the problem is, they're not just looking at the soldiers. and the Pharisees, and scribes, and the Romans, and the emperor, and Pilate, and Ananias, and the mob. He's looking down in heaven and saying, he's looking at us. You know why? Because without us, there wouldn't have been no need for the cross. If none of us had ever sinned, Jesus would have never had to come to earth. The thing is, folks, he came to earth because one of us needed salvation. He'd come if it had just been one of us. It wasn't that it was just so many, it was each one he needed, he wanted to redeem. See, the problem is, they needed forgiveness a lot more than they really knew. When Jesus cried out, Father, forgive them, for they know what they do, he was really saying, Father, forgive them, because they need forgiveness more than they know. Father, forgive them, because they are in desperate need of a forgiveness, and they don't even know it. Same is true with the people who hurt you. They need forgiveness more than they know. It's true, they know what they're doing when they made that telephone call, or when they wrote that letter, or when they said that thing or did that thing that tore your heart. When they left and walked out, they knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't know the enormity of it. They didn't know how bad and how terrible it was. They only knew about the surface. They didn't know down deep that they can never know how badly they hurt you. The people who have hurt you need your forgiveness more than they need anything else in the world. They need it more than they know. And they'll probably never change until they get it. And some of them won't change even after they get it. But still, you have to forgive them. That's the deeper meaning of that first word from the cross. You can forgive the unforgivable if you remember that the people who have hurt you so deeply don't at the deepest level know what they've really done to you. Forgiveness is what you need. Forgiveness is what they need. And you're the only one who can forgive it. How can you forgive the unforgivable? First, you remember that the people who hurt us don't really know what they're doing. And number two, it is possible to forgive the unforgivable by remembering that Jesus forgave us when we were yet his enemies, when we were unforgivable. This is where the words of Jesus become very personal. We're included in his prayer. When he prayed, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Who was included in them? The soldiers, the mob, the women, the disciples, Pilate, Caiaphas, Ananias, Judas, Peter, and all the Jewish leaders. You know who else was in it? Michael Boyd, Virginia, Danny, everybody else listening to us on live stream, everybody else in this building. We were all included in that prayer because he was praying for you and he was praying for me. When you say, oh, no, Pastor, I'm not like those people. I would have never crucified him. I'm different. I'm not that bad. I'm not the kind of man who would crucify anyone. I'd never do anything like that. Oh, yeah, you are. And yes, you would. And yes, you would have many times. And yes, you will again. You're not as good as you look. The thing is, we think we're better than we are. We run around and we think, I'm this great and wonderful person. See, the problem is we deal with pride because we think we're better than we are, that God owes us something. The only thing that we owe is we owe God. You're not as good as you think you are. If you'd been there, you would have been holding the nails. If you'd been there, you would have been clapping and cheering and maybe be throwing things at him. If you'd been there, you would have been saying, crucify him! Crucify him! Stick it to them again. Another nail! Let him have it! We're not that much different. We're not any better. You know what keeps us from forgiving people who hurt us? At the root of it is this. We think we're better than they are. We think we could never hurt anybody the way they hurt us. I'm just not as bad as that. I never treat anybody the way they treated me. We get angry because we think that we would never do to another person what they've done to us. Oh. How false. how deluded we are when we think that way. It is our false pride that keeps us from the hard step of forgiving the unforgivable. Don't you understand? It's not as if we're all good and they're bad. It's not as if we're all pure and they're evil. It's not as if we've got all of life wired together and they're just a bunch of fools. It's not as if we're totally in the right and they're totally in the wrong. It's not the way the world really works. It's not as if we know all the answers. It's not as if we're good as we think we are. As cool as we think we are. As righteous as we think we are. As justifiable as we think we are. You want to know what the truth is? We get mad just like they do. We lose our temper just like they do. We write stinging letters just like they do. We say stupid things at Christmas time just like they do. We slap our friends just like they do. Hurt our children just like they do. We crucify our friends and like they do. And we break our promises just like they do. When you really got down to it, we're just like them. No, we are them and they're us. If we don't see that, we've missed the real point of Jesus' first cry from the cross. We think we're so much better than the people who have hurt us so deeply. We're self-deluded. If only we could see. When we really get down to it, we're all the same boat. We're all truly sinners in one way or another. We all fail all the time. They fail in one way and we fail in another. We need to learn to start to see ourselves the way God really sees us. The way we really are. If we would admit that we really don't know it all, if we would admit that we really don't have it all together, if we would admit that we're not as good as we think we are, we're not as together as we pretend to be, if we'd ever admit the truth that we find it easier to forgive people who have hurt us in an unforgivable way. The secret of forgiveness is not your ability. The secret of forgiveness is to understand that between you and the person who hurt you, there's really no difference, but there's God. It's possible to forgive the unforgivable when you've got to realize, before you do it, that Jesus forgave you when you were unforgivable. When he prayed that prayer, he wasn't just praying for them back there. He was praying for all of us 20 centuries later. I think it's enormously significant that the first word from the cross is the word of forgiveness. Being told that by Jesus came to establish a religion of forgiveness. He is at heart a man of forgiveness. He came to this world to establish a church that would be an oasis of forgiveness and to bring to the world a race of forgiving men and women. It is only our false pride that keeps us forgiving. Keeps us from forgiving. Because we think we're better than everybody else. And we have a right to that. My sin nailed him to that cross. I didn't deserve his forgiveness. So the question I have to ask you is, do you want to become more like him? I think you start where Jesus started. Forgiving the people who have hurt you so deeply. You turn it over to him. Lord, I can't do this, but you can. We don't turn over a new leaf. It's not like we turn over a new leaf every year. We carry our baggage with us every year. We brought it all with us. We didn't turn anything over. Some of us brought a lot of baggage. Hurt memories, injured feelings, thoughts about the past that we can't get out of our minds, memories of people who've done us wrong. Some of you are already under a terrible burden of remembered hurts in the past. Don't you think it's time to give it all back to God? Say, God, I forgive because you forgave me. I submit this to you. I got a little project for you this week. Here's what I want you to do. When you get back to your office or get back to your house or get back to your someplace where you can find a 4x6 note card or a piece of paper and you cut it into 4 squares. I don't care how you do it. But on that piece of paper, I want you to list the top. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. On the left side of that card, I want you to write down the things and the people and the memories in the past that have hurt you. Be honest with yourself. Nobody else is going to see this. You're not asking you to bring this. You're not show and tell. This is not anything I want you to share with anybody. This is between you and God. But I want you to list everybody who ever hurt you. Everybody who's made you miserable. Everybody who's tortured you. Make it brief. Make it simple. No one ever needs to see the card. You know who they are. When you're finished, add one word in large letters to the right to each hurt from the past. They are forgiven. And when you're finished, take that little 3x5 card and rip it up into little tiny pieces. Don't keep it. Rip it into dozens of pieces and then flush the pieces down the toilet or burn them on the grill or in your fireplace. Let go of those memories and remember that God has forgiven you. He has called you to forgive others. That's what we're about. Learning to forgive. Not because we're great or we're wonderful or magnificent or any of those things. Because while we were yet his enemies, Jesus died for us on the cross. Let's close in prayer. Father, we come before you. We recognize we hold grudges. I wish you could say that I've never done that. I wish I could say that I've not let people hurt me. But I look at that cross and I recognize that Jesus Christ you had never had to die if I'd never sinned. Father, forgive me for breaking your heart. Forgive us, Lord. Forgive us. I know we're forgiven. And I know we're redeemed. The reality is, Lord, we want to be able to forgive others if you've forgiven us. Lord, I know it's not something we can do by real effort, by working really hard at it, and memorizing a bunch of Bible verses. It only comes by giving up those sins to you, or that hurt to you. I'm not mine. I'm bought with a price. You are my master and my Lord. Somebody else offends me, God, I give that person to you. Lord, somebody hurts me, I give that hurt to you. Help me to love as only you can love. Help me to show your mercy as only you can. To see others through your eyes. And to see me through your eyes. Help me to have a reality check. In your most precious Son's name.